In this video, we'll continue our study of the digestive system. The pancreas is an important accessory organ. It's C-shaped and it sits behind the stomach. So here's the stomach, and then posterior to the stomach is the pancreas. Notice the C shape right here, and notice how it fits up against the proximal part of the small intestine called the duodenum. There's two main parts: the head of the pancreas, that's this part here, and then the tail of the pancreas, that's this portion over here. Just like the stomach secreted gastric juice, the pancreas secretes pancreatic juice. The pancreatic juice consists of pancreatic amylase. Remember, salivary amylase was released by the salivary glands, and that broke down carbohydrates. Same thing here. Pancreatic amylase breaks down carbohydrates. Pancreatic lipase, that breaks down fats. There's two different nucleases, and those break down nucleic acids. Remember, nucleic acids would be like DNA and RNA. And there's three different types of enzymes that break up proteins called protease, or proteolytic enzymes. And those break down proteins into smaller nutrients called amino acids. And also the pancreas secretes bicarbonate ion. You remember from chemistry, bicarbonate acts as a buffer, and it's a little bit basic. So that increases the pH of the duodenum. And then these enzymes function better at those higher pHs. Pancreatic juice is released into the duodenum at the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So let's take a closer look at that. So pancreatic juice is created and secreted by the pancreas. It flows through the pancreatic duct, and then it's released here. Here's a blow-up picture of it at the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Hepato meaning liver, pancreatic, of course, referring to the pancreas, and the ampulla is this little bulb spot right here. There's also the hepatopancreatic sphincter. So that controls the release of pancreatic juice. The liver is another important accessory organ. It's located in the upper right quadrant of the abdominal cavity. Here's the upper right quadrant. You can see some extends into the upper left quadrant as well. But you can actually feel or palpate the liver underneath your rib cage just a little bit. It's divided into lobes. Primary divisions would be like the right lobe and the left lobe. It's divided by this ligament here. Astonishingly, the liver performs over 200 functions. We're just going to focus on one of its important digestive functions. The liver secretes bile. It's a yellowish green substance composed of water, bile pigments like bilirubin, cholesterol, electrolytes, and bile salts. So one of the functions that the liver performs, we learned about earlier when we talked about blood, is that old red blood cells are recycled in the liver. And the hemoglobin, that's the protein that's inside the red blood cells, that's broken down by the liver. And one of the byproducts, or one of the waste products of hemoglobin breakdown, is bilirubin. So bilirubin gives bile its yellowish green color. And then electrolytes, that's like sodium and potassium and chloride ions. Let's take a closer look at the bile salts. The bile salts emulsify fat by breaking up the fat globules into smaller droplets. That's similar how to detergent would work. And then once the fat is broken up into smaller molecules, lipase, remember that's an enzyme responsible for breaking up fats, or for breaking down fats rather, then the lipase can more easily access and break down those droplets after it's been emulsified into smaller droplets. So one way to think about emulsifying is if you've ever had vinaigrette dressing, the oil and vinegar separate out, but if you shake it up, that kind of emulsifies it a little bit, and it breaks it up into smaller droplets, and then those smaller droplets sort of get suspended in one another. Also, milk that's been homogenized, that's also emulsified, so it no longer separates out into watery components and fat components, kind of all mixes together. And what does it again are these bile salts right here. So this is an example of a bile salt, and the bile salts emulsify the fat. The gallbladder is another accessory organ. It's a pear-shaped sac located on the inferior surface of the liver. So there it is. And that stores and concentrates bile in between meals. Bile is released into the duodenum at the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Now we saw that before. So if we zoom in on this, here's what we have. Remember, this is the pancreatic duct that's coming from the pancreas. And this is what's called the common bile duct that's here, and that's coming from the liver. The common bile duct and the pancreatic duct converge, and they meet together at this hepatopancreatic ampulla. And both the liver and the pancreas release their contents in the same spot in the duodenum. Let's look at some of the anatomy around the gallbladder. We have the common hepatic duct. There's all these little hepatic ducts that are draining from the liver. And when they converge, that's the common hepatic duct. We have the cystic duct, that's right here, that connects the gallbladder to the common bile duct, or your book just refers to it as the bile duct. So we have the common hepatic duct, the cystic duct, and then the common bile duct. And notice again that they converge with the pancreatic duct, so they can dump their contents through one opening. Here's another view which I think is helpful. So we have these smaller little hepatic ducts. When these hepatic ducts come together, they form what's called the common hepatic duct. That's right here. Here's the cystic duct again that connects the gallbladder to the common bile duct. So where the cystic duct and the common hepatic duct merge, that's the common bile duct. Now the reason why this anatomy is important, a general surgeon, sort of what they do with their bread and butter is taking out appendixes and gallbladders. That's what a general surgeon does. They do a lot of things, of course, but sort of on a routine basis, they will remove gallbladders. And it's important to know the anatomy surrounding the gallbladder so this can be removed properly. Under certain conditions, cholesterol, remember cholesterol was a component of the bile, that may precipitate in the gallbladder and form gallstones. So precipitating is when it sort of aggregates together and makes a solid. So here's an individual that has gallstones in their gallbladder. So this person could potentially have to have their gallbladder removed. A procedure called a cholecystectomy. All right, let's look at the small intestine. The small intestine runs from the pyloric sphincter of the stomach, remember that's here, this is the pylorus, this is the pyloric sphincter, to the cecum of the large intestine. So here's the cecum of the large intestine. So it's very long. We have the duodenum here, the jejunum in blue, and then the ileum in green. So it's about 20 feet long. So what the small intestine does is it continues digestion and the absorption of nutrients, and of course also peristalsis moves the contents through. But when we say digestion, again, we're looking at enzymes. Peptidase, so that breaks up peptides, that's proteins. Sucrase, that would break up sucrose, which is sugar. Maltase, which would act on maltose, which is also a sugar. Lactase would break apart lactose, which is a sugar. And intestinal lipase, remember lipase breaks up fat. There's three portions. We certainly need to know these. These are important. We have the duodenum. We've talked about that a lot. That's only like 10 inches long or so. That's just right here. Remember the pancreas would be right here. It's just not shown. And then after the duodenum, right distal to that, we have the jejunum. That's the portion shown in like cyan color. And then distal to the jejunum, we have the ileum. The ileum is shown in green. So then the contents go from the stomach to the duodenum, through the jejunum, through the ileum, and then ultimately will be ejected into the large intestine here. Before we move on to the large intestine, let's look at the small intestines with the associated mesentery. So the jejunum and ileum, remember these are parts of the small intestine, they're suspended from the posterior abdominal wall by a double layered fold of peritoneum called mesentery. So here's a pretty good cartoon of that. So here's the jejunum and the ileum, and this is the mesentery. It's not shown in this picture, but this mesentery then attaches to the posterior wall. So this is what keeps your intestines from getting all coiled up and tangled up in knots. There's actually this connective tissue that keeps it in line. So here's a good picture, a little bit confusing, but follow with me. So when we learned about the heart, we learned that was in the pericardial cavity. When we learned about the lungs, we learned that that was in the pleural cavity. The abdominal cavity as something called the peritoneum or the peritoneal cavity. That's where you find a lot of the abdominal pelvic contents. So during development, this is like one continuous sheet, and the organs sort of like are folded into it, if you will. So what we're looking at here is mesentery. This is mesentery. This is all mesentery here. And that's all part of the peritoneal cavity. We have the the parietal peritoneum, which covers the abdominal wall, both the anterior and posterior, and then the visceral peritoneum that covers the small intestines, the organs themselves. And then there's like a potential space that exists in between the visceral and the parietal peritoneum, and that's like the peritoneal cavity. That's where all these abdominal contents are suspended from. There's something called the greater omentum. That's this right here. It's a big double-folded sheet of peritoneum, and we'll see this when we do the fetal pig dissection, so that's something to look out for. And the mesentery contains blood vessels and nerves. That's illustrated here. That's what feeds the intestinal wall. Also, I should notice that some of the organs are actually not in the peritoneal cavity, but are behind the peritoneal cavity. Those are called retroperitoneal. So, for example, the pancreas is behind the peritoneum, and a part of the duodenum is also behind the peritoneum. And some of the large intestine, like the rectum, is also behind the peritoneum, and the kidneys are retroperitoneal as well. The rest of the abdominal cavity, or the abdominal contents, are in the peritoneal cavity. Lastly, let's look at the large intestine. Now, the large intestine is called large because of its diameter, not its length. It's only about 5 feet long, but you'll notice it is larger in diameter. The large intestine absorbs water, electrolytes, and vitamins. Some of the vitamins are actually synthesized by the bacteria that live in your colon. Large intestine also secretes mucus. It doesn't absorb or digest nutrients. That's important to know. All the breakdown of nutrients and all the absorption of nutrients, that's already taken place at this point. So at this point, when the food is moved into the large intestines, it's then called feces. So the large intestine stores feces, and feces is composed of water, mucus, lots of bacteria, shed intestinal cells, and undigested material like cellulose, like plant matter, stuff like that. So this is a micrograph. You can see the simple columnar epithelium, but these are called goblet cells. We don't need to know that, but these goblet cells secrete mucus. So there's lots of mucus secretion in the large intestine. Let's look at the parts of the large intestine. Remember, the ileum was the most distal portion of the small intestine. The ileum dumps its contents through this ileocecal valve or ileocecal sphincter, and it dumps it into what's called the cecum. That's this portion here. Notice your appendix hangs off the cecum right there. People oftentimes have to get their appendix removed if they have appendicitis. That's called an appendectomy. We have the ascending colon. It's ascending colon because it goes up. We have the transverse colon because it transverses the abdominal cavity. And then we have the descending colon. And then the sigmoid colon kind of makes like an S shape. And then the rectum. And then lastly, the anus. That's the part that exits your body. Let's take a closer look at the rectum and the anal canal. I'm showing you this because this is one of the first slides we saw your first week of anatomy. So we'll also end the class with where we started it. Notice the difference in epithelium. So this is the rectum here. And all those little goblet cells, remember the ones that secrete mucus? Those are all those like large transparent ones. But this is all simple columnar epithelium, even down in these pits here. And that's specialized for secretion of mucus. And then when we transition to the anus, there's no longer any secretion taking place there. This is just a protective barrier. So notice it's stratified squamous epithelium.